afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the California ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the Subscriber Participating Transmission Owner Model meeting to discuss the straw proposal. My name is Caitlin McGee, representing the Stakeholder Affairs Group here at the ISO, and I will be facilitating today's meeting. I'm also joined by Deb Levine, Director of Infrastructure Contracts and Management. As a reminder, the presentation and agenda for this meeting can be found on the Policy Initiatives webpage under the Stay Informed tab on our website. Before we get started, a few housekeeping reminders. This call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. This meeting is structured to stimulate dialogue and engage different perspectives, but we do ask that you please keep your comments professional and respectful, and then also try to keep your comments as brief as possible and refrain from repeating anything that has already been said. If you do have a question, there are a few ways to raise your hand. If you're connected to audio through your computer, you can use the raise hand icon above the chat window. If you called in and are on audio only, you can press #2. And then also you can put your question into the chat and I can read it aloud for you if that's how you'd like to ask your question. When asking a question, please remember to state your name and affiliation before making a comment. And if through this presentation you have any issues or need technical assistance, you can chat the event producer or myself, Caitlin McGee. So before we get started, here's a quick visual of our policy initiative stakeholder process. We're really at the beginning of this process here with the straw proposal, and then the rest of the process is shown there on the screen. So with that, I'll hand it over to Deb to get started.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Caitlin. Greatly appreciate it. First, I'd like to start by apologizing for the last minute switch in days for the presentation. I had a personal emergency I needed to take care of and wasn't available yesterday as originally anticipated. So this is a follow-on from the subscriber participating TO model discussions that we had last August, October, and then again in December. So as we talked in the December presentation, we are moving this into the stakeholder initiative. The straw proposal was published on the February 7th, and we'll move it forward as we typically do in our stakeholder initiatives. So the reason behind this initiative is looking at projects kind of ahead of the curve compared to the window that the transmission planning process has for us. So the CPUC has already come out with their preferred system plan, which calls for 1,500 megawatts by 2032 of Wyoming wind. And then if you look at the high transportation electrification portfolio the CPUC put out, that in essence adds another 4,800 megawatts by 2035. And that's based on a total of 80,000 megawatts that needs to be on the grid by 2035. And then they also went ahead and the CEC and the CPUC combined, looking at the 20-year outlook, called for 10,000 gigawatts of out-of-state wind in-state, and then another 10,000 megawatts offshore. So we're going to need a lot of wind coming in the future in order to meet our requirements in 2040. And for those of you that have been involved in this for a while, you know, we're looking at a load of 120,000 megawatts in the year 2040. So we're trying to get ahead of the curve. It ended up that Transwest Express, which is the first project to sign up for or consider the subscriber PTO model, has not been chosen in the transmission planning process. but is willing to go ahead and get subscribers to build the line all the way to California and not put the line in the TAC. And I have to remember, I'm actually advancing the slides this time around. As far as the considerations, overarching considerations and concepts that we've talked about now for quite a while, is that predominantly the transmission would be used to meet state or utility clean energy policies. It's set up so that most of the transmission capacity is subscribed in at least one direction. Since their subscribers are going to be paying for that transmission line to be built, we would go ahead and provide them with an encumbrance, similar to what we do today for our existing contracts. We would also go ahead and put the subscriber PTO in its own transmission access area. So it's any of its fees that are associated with the, that are allocated on a transmission access area would be allocated to them and not to anyone else. We'd also go ahead and require them to fund through their own transmission revenue requirements from the subscriber all of the transmission interconnection that's required for the project. And to the extent that a non-subscriber goes ahead and uses the transmission line, there would be an incremental charge associated with that. As far as documentation is concerned, we're looking at going ahead and doing an amendment to the transmission control agreement, and then implementation of what gets put into the transmission control agreement. There are some sections in the tariff that are going to need amendment. And Jeff Nelson, I see your hand is raised. Operator, if you could open his line, please.
Good afternoon, Debbie. I hope you can hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Good, and I hope Paul's well. Sorry to hear about some emergency. Let's see. I mean, you can maybe have to answer this later, but I'm a little confused on what it means when it says that a non-subscriber would have to pay. Does that mean, I'm just a little confused, and I don't know if we'll get into it. Does that mean the person actually, if they were in like Wyoming but not a subscriber, would have to, and it was a generator just having a bid in Wyoming, they would have to pay for transmission if their bid was accepted by the market?
Yeah. So to the extent
so that's radically different than anything we do in the ISO today, right? Because right now all transmission is paid for by people that are pulling out of the grid. No one pays to come into the grid today.
Well, yes and no. If you're a generator in Wyoming and you want to use that transmission line, you're going someplace. So you're either going off of that transmission line, the subscriber PTO transmission line, you're serving load in the CAISO balancing authority area and you pay the TAC, or
well, but the load pays the load would pay the TAC there. So maybe let me rephrase the question. I mean, are we still proposing that only withdrawals pay for transmission, or do now we have people injecting at Wyoming having to pay for transmission?
Only the withdrawals.
Okay, that clarifies things. Hopefully you can expand on that a little bit as it goes forward, because you know, if someone's just bidding, if there's this generator in Wyoming bidding at the end point of the line, they're just load and whatever, California just consuming power, they don't know where the power is coming from.
Correct.
So I'll pause. Okay, but it's not an injection fee; it's all withdrawal fee. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
No, it's all a export fee or load fee for within the CAISO BA.
Okay, thank you.
And Jeff, hopefully you're still on.
I'm here.
Which bullet did you think I said that? This second one from the bottom?
You may not have been on the bullet. It may have been something you talked over the bullet when you
Oh,
said
okay.
someone that was a non-subscriber would have to pay to use the transmission.
Right. Okay. All right. Gotcha. That's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So one of the things that we did do in December is, unlike a competitive solicitation project where we have an agreement with the entity that was awarded the competitive solicitation, we haven't set up an agreement with this applicant, what we're calling the applicant participating transmission owner. And the reason why we need the agreement is because between now and whenever the line comes online, which if you're talking about Transwest Express, they're looking at 2027, we need someone who's going to participate in the transmission planning process. For the generator interconnection, we need them to do the studies for the generator interconnection. There needs to be communication back and forth. Do they have subscribers? Don't they have subscribers? Are they going to be moving forward with actually building this line? Are they not going to build the line? And so it's this applicant PTO agreement that we filed at FERC on January 13th and are expecting a decision on March 14th. The only one that filed comments was NextEra, to the best of my knowledge. The ISO did file reply comments, and the concern that they had was more about how the SPTO is going to work, not how Transwest is going to go ahead and participate in all of the activities that go on with a transmission line that hasn't been built yet between the time that the line is built and the line actually comes into service. So that's kind of a new thing, and that's what we went to the board for in December, was solely to go ahead and get approval to put that agreement in place so that we could make sure when the Cluster 15 window does open, that we've got a participating TO that's going to do the studies for the generation that is going to interconnect to that line. Any questions on the applicant PTO? Because I'm not going to come back to it. Okay, seeing none, thank you. Okay, so the rationale for treating subscriber rights as an encumbrance is that if any other entity, let's say like PacifiCorp or Bonneville or APS or Nevada Energy were to join the ISO as a participating TO, we would take on all of their existing contracts as encumbrances. That's part of the process that we go through in the transmission control agreement. The encumbrance, what it does is it gives the right holder what we call the perfect hedge. So it doesn't charge them for transmission because they've already paid in their existing contract for transmission. And it doesn't charge them for congestion because they, in essence, have the first right of refusal to use that line. In addition, it gives the right holder a scheduling priority. Since they've had the contract on that line for 1 year, 10 years, 50 years, whatever time frame the contract might have been previously executed, that establishes that they have superior rights to the market that is coming in now. The other reason for treating the subscriber rights as an encumbrance is the ISO already has the software and the tariff functionality to have the subscriber rights as an encumbrance. We use a contract reference number, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard about over the years, where they have to go from a certain source to a certain sink. And that's the rights that they have on the transmission line to ensure the proper settlement of the perfect hedge and the scheduling priority. We also go ahead and for the SPTO model, it's only going to be for the original subscriber for the rights that are in the original subscriber's agreement. So to the extent that the contract is for, let's say, 30 years, then they have the right for 30 years. If the contract has a first right of refusal to extend for 10 years, and they decide to extend the contract for 10 years, then it would be for 40 years. So it's whatever is in the original agreement that the subscriber signed is what the term of the encumbrance would be. And that's also consistent with what we do for all of our agreements. To the extent that they have a certain term, it's not a rollover contract where I get to re-up this every 5 years if I want to. It's a specific term that has an end to it, not a forever contract that can go on forever. And then the way we're setting up the subscriber PTO model is that after that period of time is done, then any additional capacity that comes onto the line is not going to be considered an encumbrance. That would be treated as if it were part of the market. They'd have to schedule it through the market. If a generator other than the first original subscriber to the line wants to interconnect to the line, they don't get an encumbrance entitlement either. So it's just the person who originally agreed to pay for the transmission line based on the subscriber agreement with the transmission owner. That's the term of the contract, and those are the only entities that get to use the encumbrance terms and conditions of the ISO tariff. I'd also note that this is the same functionality that is being anticipated for the extended day-ahead market for all of the EDAM BAAs that have existing contracts. It's the exact same thing. So the subscriber will need to schedule in the day-ahead market. If they don't schedule in the day-ahead market, the market can use that excess transmission. If they come back in real time and schedule in real time, then same thing that's happened for the last 25 years, we redispatch the system to handle the existing contract first, and then go ahead and handle the generation that came out of the day-ahead market. So that's the rationale behind using the encumbrances and the subscriber rights. Does anybody, oh, I have one more. Hold on. And as far as in WEEM today, if they are to come online before EDAM is in place, in WEEM today, what ends up happening is that if you're going across WEEM balancing authority areas, there is no charge because of the reciprocity rule. That would hold true for this line if it comes on, if WEEM, the Western EIM is in place. If it comes online, they're looking, Transwest Express is looking at 2027. So by then we'll be in EDAM, and the same thing, since PAC is joining, then any transactions coming in from Ferris to Wyoming will be treated as, won't be charged because of the reciprocity rule. And I would just note that there were a couple of entities that had comments on the December paper about why aren't we just giving this transmission line congestion revenue rights as a substitute for giving them encumbrances and full allocation of their project. And the reason is because the ISO has never been successful in compensating a transmission line to be built using just CRRs. The line would never be built. And this line is more than half DC, and DC doesn't have congestion. So you don't do congestion management on a DC line, so it would be even less revenue that they would receive. So that's why we're trying to put together another option for entities to join, especially given the amount of generation that California is going to need in the future to meet our green portfolio, along with all of the offshore wind that's coming on. So with that, that's all I have on encumbrances and subscriber rights. So I see we have a few hands in the queue. So let me start with Jeff Nelson again.
Great, thank you again. Just making sure you can hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, it's Jeff Nelson, SE. Debbie, let me start on the CRR issue because that was one of the ones we were commenting. We weren't suggesting that this line be funded by CRRs. We never were suggesting that. This line is already funded. It's already been funded by subscribers. The ISO doesn't have to give them anything because it's funded. So we were not trying to get lines built by using CRRs. What we were trying to address was the encumbrance issue, because with the encumbrance comes the potential for scheduling after the day ahead market and creating an uplift cost. So we were suggesting that instead of giving them an encumbrance, that they be given CRRs. They're going to pay for their line through their subscribers, so they don't need any money from the ISO. And that kind of raises other questions, that if there is a redispatch cost, who pays for the redispatch cost?
Same thing that happens. So two things. If I can go back to your first question. So giving who the CRRs?
Transwest Express, the transmission line owner. And that was the idea of giving CRRs, was in lieu of them having a wheeling access charge, and in lieu of them having to file some sort of rate for a line that's already paid for to get incremental wheeling revenues that go to themselves, I guess, and don't lower rates anywhere. In lieu of them having that whole process of getting a separate rate at FERC, just give them CRRs and call it a day.
Okay. Okay. Sorry, I didn't understand that in the comments.
Yeah. And I mean, I'll follow on to because with the redispatch, there can be an uplift, right? If they don't schedule day ahead, people can use the line. And then if they schedule in real time, there can be a redispatch, and that can create an uplift.
Correct.
And we were trying to avoid that. And I'll just add as a comment, to the extent that they are collecting any revenue through some other mechanism, again, we still think just give them CRRs and call it a day. But to the extent that the line is collecting some sort of revenue through wheeling, through some sort of access charge, the first use of that revenue should be to pay down any uplift that they've created to the market.
Interesting thought. The intention is that they would, since the line is only subscribed in one direction, although fully paid for by the subscribers that are going from north to south, the thought is to go ahead and that revenue would be used to pay the subscribers, because the line actually can go in two directions.
Yeah, that doesn't, again, that doesn't seem appropriate if they're going to have a model that creates uplift to the ISO's market, and there's additional revenue they're creating, to not give it back to the market and instead give it back to the owners. It just doesn't seem appropriate.
Today, Southern California Edison has probably 20 contracts, existing contracts that still exist, and the uplift, to the extent that the contract right holder doesn't schedule in the day ahead and waits until real time, that uplift is going to the market. So what makes Edison different than the subscriber PTO as far as the market costs are concerned?
Because this is a brand new flavor of transmission that the ISO is going to put into its grid. It's not an existing contract of a balancing authority that has become an ISO transmission member, or PTO. This is
right.
A new flavor of transmission, and we never suggested any sort of new flavor of transmission that would create uplift to others. That was a conversion process to get us into the grid.
Well,
So,
if this were Pacific Corp or APS or SRP joining, they would be in the same situation, and any redispatch in real time for any of their existing contracts would be an uplift to the market.
well, but it's not. It's not, and it's a question of, if we get into sort of an RTO mode for the conversion process, who should be paying for these uplifts. So we're not an RTO, we're still the ISO. This isn't another balancing authority joining and turning its assets over. It's a new transmission project that bypassed the transmission planning process. And instead, there's a new flavor of transmission being developed. We shouldn't develop a new flavor of transmission that creates uplifts.
So in my scenario, I was suggesting that APS joins the ISO.
Not having them have a revenue requirement, well, and instead of treating them as an encumbrance, give them CRRs, and to the extent they schedule day ahead, there's no problem. To the extent they schedule past day ahead, they're on the hook for the costs of that scheduling. And at a minimum, if they are going to get some revenue, we should make the rule that the first use of that revenue goes to offset the uplift they created. So this seems like it's sort of an extreme of that spectrum to where they get to create uplift and have no obligation to pay for it, and they get to collect extra revenue through wheeling. It seems unbalanced.
Okay, if you could include that in your comments, that'd be great.
Great, Debbie, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Stephen Shoemaker?
Hi, yeah, this is Steve from the Public Advocate's Office. I just had a quick question about the last bullet point about being unable to add future subscribers. Apologize if I'm misunderstanding this, but in the event that, let's say, Transwest would contract with, for example, or someone else would contract with a community choice aggregator here in California, and they would maybe shut down, which, you know, hopefully won't happen, but it's been known to happen. Can subscribers be swapped out or kind of augmented down the line in the case that a off-taker is no longer around and then frees up some space? Is that possible, or is that?
So the subscriber for Transwest Express is the power company of, and so they've got all 3,000 megawatts of the transmission line. So they would have off-takers that would go ahead and change, you know, over the years, I imagine.
Okay, so in subscriber, and that would be the case in future future models where the subscriber is usually the generation and they're free to kind of manage it how they need to. But you can't change subscribers after
You can't.
Yeah.
You can't change the main subscriber unless the agreement has an assignment right in it to assign the whole contract to someone else. Working in the generator interconnection area, there's a lot of that where somebody will go ahead and assign their entire project to somebody else. Then that would be allowed, but it would not be that, you know, I'm going to go ahead and add, this is a 3,000 megawatt line. I'm going to go ahead and add another 1,000 megawatts and build another 1,000 megawatts on the line to get all this encumbrance and subscriber rights.
Okay. Yeah, thanks.
Sure. Operator, can you open up Steve Keen's line? Steve, your line, oh, it was available. There you go.
Okay, Stephen, I think that you keep remuting yourself. I have unmuted your line, so you may go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. When you talked about the transfers going through the WEIM and that they would be subject to the reciprocity rule, I'm just trying to understand. So if one of these unsubscribed generators up in Wyoming sells power through, if they sell it to somebody in the CAISO, or if it's transferred to somebody in the CAISO, then that subscriber charge would apply. But if it goes through to somebody else in WEIM, say Arizona, then they're not going to have to pay that charge?
Okay, let me see if I understand your scenario. There's a generator in Wyoming that's not in a Western EIM balancing authority area at the moment. Is that correct?
or I don't know, it could be, I don't think is important, but it's not a subscriber to the Transwest Express.
Well, it's important from a Western EIM standpoint. So the only entities that get in the Western EIM, the only entities that get the reciprocity rule, we won't charge you transmission if you don't charge us transmission, is where the entity has to be in a Western EIM BA. So as an example, if it's in Pacific Core, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say either assume it's in Pacific or assume it's in like LADWP at Intermountain Power.
Okay, so both of those, then they wouldn't be charged the subscriber charge.
Okay, even if the difference is, in one it's taken out by a ISO load serving entity, and in another it's taken out by, say, an APS load serving entity.
So APS goes also to the ISO is a Western EIM BA, and APS is a Western EIM BA. So in all of those instances, then the reciprocity rule applies, and so the transmission is not charged.
Okay. I think I understand that. And so then can we look at the other example you were talking about? If it's not in an EIM entity, it's outside of EIM.
Yeah, let's say it's coming in from Excel or something into the Ferris substation and into the transmission line, which in essence is part of the CAISO BA. Then they would have to pay the subscriber charge because we don't have a reciprocity agreement with Excel.
But what if it comes in there and then goes out to APS?
APS, we do have a reciprocity agreement with because they're a Western EIM entity.
So that means if they bring it in and sell it to a California entity, somebody's paying that subscriber charge. If they bring it in from outside of EIM and then sell it to another EIM, to a load serving entity in a different EIM balancing authority, then they don't pay the subscriber charge.
Correct.
That does not sound fair to the California LSEs.
Well, the California LSEs, to the extent that they're purchasing from a Western EIM entity, then there is reciprocity. To the extent that they're not purchasing from a Western EIM entity, then there is no reciprocity and they have to pay for the transmission. That's how the Western EIM works. John, Anders, can you help me out here? I think your line's unmuted.
John, your line's unmuted. You may go ahead. I think John may be having some audio problems with his WebEx audio, so I think he's gonna try again.
Okay. John's much more versed in the Western EIM rules than I am.
All right, John, are you unmuted? Can you hear us? Yeah, John, you're breaking up a little, so you might need to hang up and dial back in. Yeah, we're unable to hear you, John. Hang up and dial back in. Your audio is breaking up.
Okay. Steve Keen, we'll go ahead and come back to you after John dials back in. let me take the question from Jordan. Can you?
Yeah, thanks, Deb. Can you hear me all right?
I can, thank you.
Great. So just what I think is a clarification question on the subscriber scheduling priority on the project. I just want to confirm, so the scheduling priority would just be on the new portion of the project, the TWE, and when it gets to the actual ISO balancing authority at say El Dorado, it would not have a scheduling priority anymore. It would have to essentially compete against other sources at that intertie?
That's
okay.
Correct.
Okay, that's what I thought. Thank you.
Perfect. Sure. Do we have John Anders now?
Maybe. Can you hear me?
Yay! Yes.
All right. I just had to dial in on my phone. So I missed some of that, but I think I understood everything. And I think just about everything on EIM transfers and the reciprocity was correct, except you have to remember that that reciprocity applies just to real-time transfers. So that's the optimization of the different balancing authorities and the energy transfer system resources that are facilitating that transfer, not a schedule or a bid from a resource. Take the Pacific Core resource, bids into participating in Pacific Core's balancing area, bids into the market in Pacific Core. It's dispatched as an optimal resource in the real time in the Pacific Core balancing area. The output of that results in a transfer to California. That's the way it works. There's no charge for that transmission into California, and if that flows all the way through to Arizona, there's no charge. But if it's serving demand in California under a contract or resource adequacy or otherwise, and is scheduling into California and bidding, self-scheduling in that way, then that transmission service would be required, because it's not an EIM transfer at that point. So that was the only thing I wanted to clarify.
Steve Keen, does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Steve Shoemaker, your hand is still up. Do you have another question?
No, sorry about that.
Okay, great. All right, moving on to project transmission costs. So the cost to build the transmission line and interconnect it into the ISO will not be included in the TAC or the wheeling access charge. As currently proposed, Transwest would develop a subscriber charge for non-subscribers that use the project that will accrue to Transwest as the PTO. That's what we do for all of our participating TOs. I have a $1 per megawatt hour value based on the transfer capability if they're an intertie, or based on a pro rata share to the extent that they're just part of the internal workings of the ISO balancing authority area. The project would be modeled in the full network model, so it's fully available for the market, especially in the opposite direction. And then, as I said earlier, if the subscriber does not self-schedule on the project, it's available for use by the market. In order for Transwest or the SPTO to have a subscriber charge, they would have to go to FERC and get that charge approved by FERC, consistent with any other participating TO in the ISO. And then once that rate is approved, it would be provided to the ISO in accordance with the ISO tariff rules. So the thought at the moment is that the teal lines are the subscribers, So the generation is connecting at Wyoming substation. Then it goes down to Utah. And between Wyoming and Utah is a 3,000 megawatt DC line, and 1,500 megawatts will get off at IPP, or have the capability of getting off at IPP. And then the remaining, and that's an AC line, and then the remaining 1,500 megawatts will come down to TWE Crystal, which could connect with Crystal, could connect with Harry Allen, or connect with what we're calling the new substation, which would be a looped-in substation between the Harry Allen El Dorado line that is already currently part of the ISO control grid. And then new firm use is orange, and the new firm use is a non-subscriber, so they would pay for the use from Ferris down to Utah. They could get out at Utah, they could get out at Crystal, they can go all the way down and get out at El Dorado or get out at Harry Allen in Nevada's balancing authority area. And the same thing for going upstream. All paths will be available because there are no subscribers going from south to north. So the subscriber rights and obligations. So as I said earlier, the subscriber has already paid for the transmission. As part of their subscription, they're actually also paying for the energy from the wind plant that is going to be connecting at Wyoming. So that's already paid for, and then the congestion, since they've already paid for the transmission line, they get a perfect hedge, which means they don't have to pay for the congestion. But that only gets them down as far as right here, the new substation, okay? If they're not getting out at IPP, Crystal, or Harry Allen, and they're gonna come through El Dorado into the ISO balancing authority area, then they are going to end up paying the transmission access charge if the generation is synced to the load in the ISOBA, or if they're going to go out, let's say at Palo Verde or Hacienda or Delaney, when that line gets built, then they would pay the wheeling access charge as an export point. The subscriber will receive the perfect hedge and have the scheduling priority, and they're excluded from the big cost recovery allocation offsets and the day-ahead congestion allocation, just like any other encumbrance. The non-subscriber rights and obligations. The non-subscriber will pay the tax once it gets to El Dorado and the subscriber charge if they're using the subscriber PTO transmission line. If they're going to go ahead and go all the way from Wyoming and go out to Arizona, then in essence, they would pay the subscriber charge and the wheeling access charge if they're going to go ahead and be an export off of the ISO control grid that is not part of the subscriber, not part of the subscriber portion. And the non-subscriber will pay all applicable market charges, unlike a subscriber who gets a couple of charges waived. And before we go on to WEAM and EDAM, does anybody have any questions at this point? I see, Bert, you've got your hand raised. Go ahead,
Go ahead,
Bert.
your line is unmuted. But remember to unmute your device. If you're double muted, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead. All right. Looks like he's muted himself. Do you want to move on to the next caller?
Sure. We'll take Lauren and then straighten out Bert. Lauren Carr, you had a question?
Yeah, thanks, Deb. This is Lauren Carr with Cal CCA. I was wondering about what happens to cost recovery once the subscriptions end? Would they then be recovered through TAC or still the subscriber charge?
They would then be recovered through TAC.
Okay, thanks.
But by that point in time, the line's fully depreciated, so it's O&M cost.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Bert, do we have you now?
But go ahead, your line is unmuted. No, I think Bert's still struggling with his audio for right now.
Okay.
But I'll send you another way to dial in, and then we can come back to you. All right?
Okay.
Would you like to go to Jeff?
Yeah, Jeff.
Hello again. I'm texting Bert saying, hey, what were you trying to ask? I'll try to ask for you. You just said something that gave me the heebie-jeebies, that after the subscriber is over, it goes into TAC. Now let's just, you said by that time it's fully depreciated. Well, what if it's not? What if it's a subscriber line for 1 year? So you get what I'm saying? It's a 50-year, 30-year plant, and the subscriber models only covers a mere fraction of what the total line cost and depreciation would be of it. And this, again, has not gone through any part of the transmission planning process, no cost review or anything. If the rule is after this subscriber expires, it goes into TAC, that could have material consequences. So I need to think about that, but that doesn't sound right to me. Maybe at the best O&M goes in.
Yeah, the intention is that the subscriber rights would be for the life of the line. So the 30 years, 40 years, depending upon the transmission line. It was never intended that the you could have a 1-year subscriber. You build a whole transmission line for a 1-year subscriber. So that's good clarification, Jeff.
Yeah, and Bert texted me, so I'm going to ask on behalf of Bert.
Okay, great.
He wanted to know about, because we do this in my shop, how the subscriber wheeling rate was going to be sort of calculated or approved, especially if the line is being fully paid for by subscribers. I don't know if we have anything in there. And also he said, who exactly pays the TAC for imports? Load? And this is, I think this was getting to my earlier question that if a generator is just in Wyoming, that's not a subscriber, because like, as I understand this, if there's room on the line, it's just like an intertie, right? It just, anyone can bid. And once that happens, we don't know where the power is going. So it's not clear who's going to pick up sort of the, if I understand this, sort of the pancaking of, you go a certain distance on the Transwest Express, and once you hit that toll gate, you have to pay the Transwest toll. And then you continue going to the ISO, and then you pay the ISO's sort of, takeout charge or TAC.
Right.
So it's unclear to us. It's unclear to us how that works if the load is sinking within the ISO. At least it's unclear to me.
Well, in essence, for all boundaries, we know what goes in and what goes out. So if you have more generation coming in than you have at the takeout points of IPP, Crystal, Harry Allen, that it's within the CAISO BA. So then the load would pay for the TAC.
And if it's being pulled out at like Crystal,
and by a subscriber, then they've already paid for the usage. If it's just a generator up in Wyoming that's using the line, then they would pay for the WAC on the way out.
So that raises another question on sort of the subscriber. I mean, if I understand this, the generation is going to be part of the ISO's balancing authority, the wind in Wyoming. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, and then a subscriber I'm going to pick on LADWP, so we'll just use them as a hypothetical. They're a subscriber and they're pulling wind out, and I'm just going to make up numbers. They have a 800 megawatt day ahead schedule with the wind, and they're pulling it out at IPP. 800 megawatts, that's great. Let's just say they don't do anything else, but the wind only blows 700 megawatts in real time. LA still pulled out 800 because they had an 800 megawatt schedule. The wind only blew 700. Where is the extra 100 megawatts coming from? And who's paying for the transmission to get that extra 100 megawatts to LA?
So LA would be paying for the transmission.
Okay, so because they're probably pulling out of the ISO's balancing authority. Let's just assume the ISO's balancing authority is making up the wind. So they're going to have to, for that imbalance, they're going to have to pay the ISO's TAC for that 100 megawatts or wheel whack charge.
Yep, that's correct.
Unless they're doing some flavor of like pseudo tie or something where the schedules are and the gen is always exactly the same. Okay, that's helpful.
Okay.
Debbie, thank you again.
All right. No problem. Jordan, do you have another question?
Yeah, I do. So Jordan Pinu from Wilkinson Barker, and it actually goes a bit to what Jeff was talking about there, and kind of the term of the agreement between the off-taker and the subscriber itself. And I think I'm a little bit confused maybe about the terminology overall, because the subscriber is, the wind in Wyoming, PCW, and then the off-taker, whoever the LLC that contracts with PCW, ends up holding those subscriber rights, right? So they sign a contract with PCW. But I guess to Jeff's kind of point, is there like a minimum term that those contracts would have to be for in order to actually, make the deal work so that there's that guaranteed cost recovery for TWE?
Right, which would be the life of the line. Typically, a transmission line is a 40-year life as far as depreciation is concerned.
Right. Yeah. So, I guess my question would be, what if PCW goes out and signs deals that are 10-year PPAs with California LSCs? What happens at the end of that 10 years?
So PCW has already executed the contract for the 40 years.
Right, as the subscriber,
but as the subscriber, correct. So if they have a 10-year contract with Cal CCA and a 10-year contract with Edison and a 20-year contract with PG&E, then all of those contracts, they'd be able to go ahead and have additional subscribers for the period of time of their original subscription or the life of the line.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense. Thanks.
Sure. Okay. Looks like we don't have anyone in the queue at the moment, so I will go on. And John, is your phone working?
I think so. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yep, I can hear you. Okay. So this is where I'm trying to get into the Western EIM and EDAM. So the net transfer capacity with other Western EIM BAs will not be charged. That's the reciprocity agreement. The net import for the subscriber charge, rate allocation, net import, typo there. So rate allocation for a subscriber charge would be paid by the load to the extent they're not a subscriber. And the day-ahead export charge would be subject to the subscriber charge when EDAM is in place. And then under consideration for EDAM is new transmission would have an estimated cost based on the wheeling, and recovery of wheeling will be through the net transfers. And that they're still working out what's going on with EDAM.
Yeah, Deb, I would just quickly add that's the transmission revenue recovery mechanism. And I think the proposal includes the concept for future upgrades that enhance the transfer capability between EDAM balancing authority areas, and then the consideration would be, is there some revenue recovery mechanism associated with the Transwest in terms of its support of the EDAM transfers, or is that not the case because of how it's configured at Ferris and all of that, like you said, remains under consideration and needs to be confirmed when things move further along.
Perfect, thanks so much. Okay, generator interconnection and deliverability. So the Cluster 15 window is scheduled to open in April. Obviously, given, for those of you that are very involved in generator interconnection process, Cluster 14 was 3 times as much as what we usually get. The process has been delayed. Cluster 15, we've gone ahead and actually done a poll to find out how many projects are thinking of coming in. And it's over, from what I understand, like 400 projects, which is going to then hamper the schedule again. So don't look at these dates. So cross out like January 24 of 2024, December 2024, March 24. We don't know what those dates are at this point in time. There is a issue paper that is being worked on by the generator interconnection staff that's going to come out at the beginning of March to discuss how we're going to deal with Cluster 15. And then FYI, use of deliverability is contingent upon network upgrades being in place in the ISO balancing authority area. Sorry, Jerry. I just saw your hand go up. You have a question?
Hi, this is Jerry Melcher at Public Advocate Office. I was just checking the queue between the posted, public queue you can download anytime. Between November and last week, there was a droppage of 89 projects out of Cluster 14, but there's no information on why there was such a drop. Was it because they didn't want to go from phase 1 to phase 2 and pay for the extra cost to go into a phase 2 study? Or where are we at in this process of getting people to a generation interconnection agreement step?
So that's exactly what happened. The posting to get into phase 2 was due on I think it was February the 10th or February the 3rd. And that's why you see the huge drop in projects, because they didn't want to go into phase 2.
Perfect. Thank you for that explanation.
Sure. And
we also have a...
hold on a second, Caitlin. Interesting little tidbit. Typically, the ISO sees anywhere from 50 to 60% drop between phase 1 and phase 2. For Cluster 14, we only saw a 40% drop. So in addition to it being a very, very large cluster, a lot more projects moved on to phase 2 than we've ever seen before. And I think Caitlin was telling me there's a question in the chat. If you are an EIM entity and a non-subscriber on the line, do you pay for wheeling? the answer would be no, because you're an EIM entity coming into an EIM entity for real time. And I'm sorry, I don't know who that question came from.
That was from Chloe Lukens.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. I had to move it up some. Okay. Ooh, oh my gosh. That was the wrong button to hit. All right. Generator interconnection network upgrades. This is the issue that NextEra brought up at, for the FERC filing on the applicant PTO agreements. And the question becomes, if when generators interconnect into the Transwest Express line, including the original generator, which is PCW, should that network upgrades, to the extent that there are any required on the existing CAISO balancing authority area, should they be reimbursed or should they not be reimbursed? And a couple of pieces of information for people. The ISO just in the interconnection process enhancement for 2021 went ahead and filed with FERC already to reimburse generators that are interconnecting in other balancing authority areas that impact the ISO grid. If there's a network upgrade required on the ISO grid, we would go ahead and reimburse that generator that's in APS, Nevada, SRP, IID, any bordering balancing authority areas that do border us. So with that coming out of ICE 2021, and we're asking for people's opinion on this, should, you know, anyone connecting to Transwest Express, including the Power Company of Wyoming, be allowed to have their network upgrades reimbursed to the extent that it is on the existing ISO transmission system. So Pushkar, operator, if you could open up his line.
Good afternoon, Deb. This is Pushkar Wagle from Flynn Resource Consultants. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So I have a couple of short comments and then a couple of questions for your consideration. First of all, I think we're fully supportive of this subscriber PTO and appreciate the CAISO's willingness to, you know, take this step towards TAC containment. And I think it does make a lot of sense to use Transwest Express as an example, because that's what you have in front of you to explain certain concepts, such as the proposed rate structure. But I guess we need to have the subscriber-based model broad enough and not just applicable to out-of-state wind situation. And for instance, you know, we probably need to make it applicable to all projects, like including offshore wind. In your mind, Deb, is there anything that you're proposing here that would make this SPTO model sort of inapplicable for, let's say, offshore wind, for instance, or?
No, it would be applicable for offshore wind. Okay. Yeah, to the extent if offshore wind is not chosen in the TPP process, then it would be eligible for the SPTO model.
Excellent. Thank you for that clarification. And regarding the additional network upgrades on the existing CAISO system, if the fundamental notion is that the SPTO does not affect the CAISO tag, then probably any transmission cost triggered by the interconnection should not be reimbursed. But that's sort of our position, and we'll put that in comments. But I did have a question about, suppose those additional network upgrades to the existing CAISO system to accommodate these resources accessed by the SPTO. The question is, how will that transmission cost would be attributed to the SPTO will be separated from other costs that are subject to TAC recovery? I think that sort of needs to be spelled out in this proposal so that there is no ambiguity about which parties are responsible for those transmission costs. Because once you get it to El Dorado or the Mountain Pass CREZ area, I think it would be, in this example, the Transverse Express projects would be just part of the projects that would be affecting the need for internal transmission upgrades. So presumably some of them would be tag-based and these would be probably one tag-based. And how would you make that distinction or cost allocation associated with those?
Yeah, we would incorporate that in as part of the tariff changes if that's
Okay.
the direction that we go.
Okay. Thank you for the clarification, and that's all I had.
Sure. Thank you. Jordan, another question?
Yep, thanks, Deb. Jordan Pinu from Wilkinson Barker. So I had a question on the top proposal when it talks about additional upgrades that might be driven by the non-subscriber generation down the road. It said that the subscriber PTO would establish a regional tax to recover those costs. And I guess my understanding would be that there would be a regional access charge component that would be recovered from kind of all of the ISO. But I'm questioning what if there was a local component? How would the local access charges be recovered from whom?
To the extent that there would be an upgrade on the local transmission, then it would be recovered just like it's recovered today.
So, and I'm testing the limits of my knowledge here, but for a non-load serving, sorry, from a non-load serving PTO, go ahead.
So if a non-load serving PTO today goes ahead and has a network upgrade on it, then the cost for non-load serving PTOs is allocated pro rata, and then the load serving PTOs get their costs are more in line with the total amount of money that is recovered for that month. I can't imagine where you would have a, 500 kV line is actually going to impact a 69 kV system. But to the extent that it were to do that, then what ends up happening as part of the IPE 2021, it ends up that to the extent that the costs associated with the low voltage facility impacted by a network upgrade for a generator coming online, it has a cap. And above that cap, then the generator doesn't get reimbursed for it. So that was part of our IPE 2021 initiative.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful.
Sure. Oh, Meg, how are you doing?
There, I'm doing well. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Okay, perfect. This is Meg McNall with Thompson Coburn for Six Cities. I had a clarifying question on this slide 17 here. And I wanted to know if the way you've kind of phrased this, it sounds like you're looking for stakeholder input and comments on what the right approach should be. Am I understanding that right?
Correct.
Okay. Okay, great. And then I had a substantive question, and I thought maybe you had covered this on your slides 13 and 14, but now I'm not sure. And I'm wondering about a scenario where you have non-subscriber generation that's interconnecting to these facilities, causes network upgrades on the CAISO system. If those upgrades were going to be reimbursed to the interconnecting resource, I'm wondering whether if the off-taker of that interconnecting resource is not a CAISO entity, will they be paying any WAC to contribute to the cost of those upgrades on the KISO system in addition to whatever they might pay as far as the subscriber wheeling charge? And I thought on slides 13 and 14, it kind of sounded like an off-taker in that situation that was not in the KISO and that was purchasing a resource that was using the Transwest Express line but wasn't part of the subscriber generation. It kind of sounded like they would pay both. And the situation I'm concerned about is making sure that if we go to a policy where there's going to be reimbursement of KISO network upgrades, that the off-taker, if that's not a KISO entity, that the off-taker is contributing to part of the cost of that through payment of, I guess it would be the WAC.
So to the extent that the subscriber is serving load within the KISO BA and or is moving through the, as an example, Transwest Express, and then it's APS, so it goes out at Palo Verde, they would pay the subscriber charge is already paid, but he would pay the WAC to get out of the KISO BA, if that's your question.
Yeah, it's sort of part of my question. Maybe what I'll do is pose the scenario that I'm thinking about in comments, and then
that would be great.
It might be easier to kind of process it that way.
Okay, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. The question that I'm trying to ask on slide 17 is that we have a situation where in recent FERC filings, we've gone ahead and if there's a generator that builds in WAPA Desert Southwest or over in APS that is going to impact the ISO's transmission grid, and we have to build a network upgrade on our system for that generator, then we've filed at FERC that we would reimburse that generator for that network upgrade. So there's that side of the story, or the other side of the story is the line was not approved by the TPP. It requires a network upgrade within our base system. They're coming into El Dorado, so it's likely to be an Edison upgrade, which Edison, if they are reimbursing them, could put into their transmission access charge. If they're not reimbursing them, then the entity would pay for it, and Edison would not put it into their transmission access charge. So the question I guess we're asking is, if this were a if they decided to be a gen-only balancing authority area and never became part of the ISO, what we have at the moment is that we would reimburse them if they were a gen-only BA for network upgrades on our system that were required for their generation in Transwest gen-only BA. And I see we have a number of questions down in the chat, so let me see if I can pick up some of these. Chloe Lukens again, if you are an EIM entity and a non-subscriber online, do you pay for wheeling? You would pay for you would not pay to come in, but to the extent that if you're going to go out of the KISO BA and not into another Western EIM entity, then you would pay for the wheeling access charge as an export. But if you're going to go ahead and come in from like PacifiCorp or IPP or Nevada Energy, who are all Western EIM entities, and then go out to Tucson, go out to IID. I don't think IID is a Western EIM entity. Then in essence, you would pay the WAC for that. Oh, sorry, you're having trouble with WebEx. And then, oh, Mike. Okay, Mike Florio's question is how does subscriber PTO model interact with the market import capability allocation? Hold that thought. Those are the next slides, is the deliverability. If TWE is at El Dorado, there's no mix at El Dorado. Okay, so your whole question's all about mix. So Mike Florio, hold that thought. Mike Whitney's comment is, why wouldn't the subscribers pay for it? Well, and I'm assuming you're talking about the network upgrades on the ISO existing system. That is an option, you know, should they be reimbursed, or if it's the answer could be no, or since they are not an approved project, then the affected system should not have to reimburse the generator. So those are the two questions that are being asked. The challenge will be is that if we've gone ahead and filed that somebody in an affected system, Bonneville, PAC, something, they build a generator and that generator impacts our grid and we have to upgrade our grid in order to meet that generator's requirements. And we're gonna pay for the upgrades associated with that generator. What makes this subscriber PTO, which ultimately becomes part of our balancing authority area, any different? But that's the exact question that we're asking here. So I think I beat that one to death. So here's Mike Florio's question. All right, so the market import capability is added at all new import points. So you'll remember we have a new import point at Ferris. We have a new import point at IPP. We have a new import point at Crystal Substation in Nevada. And our import points at Harry Allen will be greater than what our current import point is, okay? So typically what happens is that the market import capability is not likely to change at El Dorado and Harry Allen, but we will have import capability, additional import capability at IPP and at Ferris. The market import capability is allocated to load serving entities. And once the subscriber PTO generation is within the CAISO BA, they won't initially have a market import capability until we know what the flows are going to be on it, or they estimate what the flows are going to be on it. And then that deliverability will be allocated to generation, to load serving entities once it's determined what the number is. And in order to get deliverability allocation for a generator, that goes through the generator interconnection process, which is different than the market import capability. Does that make sense to everyone? Or does anyone have any questions? Okay, I will keep going. So general comments from what was received off of the December 5th presentation. So the subscriber PTO model is not a competitive solicitation project. And the ISO is trying to move forward with a model that allows, okay, hold on a second, Mike, I'll answer your question in a second. The SPTO model allows, in essence, the load-serving entities to make a determination as to what is the least cost best fit for themselves, instead of us going ahead and taking certain projects and deeming those as the, you know, here's where people need to procure their generation from because we've got the transmission line. And the subscribers will determine if the project moves forward or not based on the ability to get off-takers. If they don't get any off-takers, then obviously they aren't going to go ahead and move forward. So Mike had another question. Hold on, let me go back to the chat. Does the answer mean that a generator in Wyoming could have to pay for a network upgrade from El Dorado to CAISO load? Well, that's what the question is that I was asking on the last slide. Should Public Company of Wyoming that has purchased all of the generation coming off of Transwest Express, should they be allowed to get reimbursement from, let's say Edison has to do a network upgrade on its system at El Dorado, and then that would be incorporated into the tax, or should the generation up in Wyoming have to pay for the network upgrade? That's what the question was back on slide 17. So I'm soliciting answers, people's thoughts on that, how that should be taken care of. So in essence, kind of wrapping up here, so the subscriber PTO model will create transmission opportunities for load serving entities, where the load serving entity gets to make their own decisions as to what's best for them. It enables access to remote renewable generation, which we know we'll need. It provides incremental capacity for reasonable rates, and it's consistent with the state objectives of having out-of-state renewables. They just haven't come into our portfolios yet to be studied as broad as they need to be in order to meet the future. We're trying to go ahead and support different options for development, given the long lead time for transmission. I mean, a number of the transmission lines trying to get permitted, we're talking 10, 12 years to try and get permits in place, especially if they are, part of it is being built in California. If the line is being built out of state, we're seeing closer to 5 to 7 years for all the permitting to be done. And we're just trying to provide an open access tariff and honor the subscriber rights to the people that have already gone ahead and decided to be off-takers for the transmission. So as far as the next steps are concerned, we're having the stakeholder call today. Comments are due on the 1st of March. We do have a template, or will have a template out shortly. And then we're looking at publishing, hopefully, the draft final proposal on the 11th. If there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, then obviously it'll be a draft, a revised draft proposal. But I was trying to be optimistic and get to a draft final quick. But I was trying to target the July governing board meeting for a approval on the SPTO model. So with that, I'll open it up to anyone that has any last minute questions before I turn it back to Caitlin. Stephen Shoemaker, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, can you hear me all right?
I can.
Great. I just want to say thank you, and that overall this is a really looks like productive endeavor for ratepayers and everyone. And I think that I wanted to kind of follow up on the big picture question that Jeff raised, which is kind of, are there kind of regulatory guardrails in place in terms of this becoming another TAC funded line in 5 to 10 years? So I think there's precedent. I could recall something like the Transbay Cable was kind of privately funded right up until it wasn't, and it became kind of another TAC funded line. And so I'm guessing that the answer is that the ISO has not yet selected something like Transwest. And so like in 5 to 10 years, they wanted to just switch to being a normal, something like Harry Allen, they would have to first get ISO approval, which I suppose they could ask for in 10 years and then try to get, does that make sense? Is there a future in which this just switches gears in 5 to 10 years?
To tell you the truth, I'm not aware of a transmission line that is flipped. Transbay Cable, if I remember correctly, was actually something that we did approve because we were losing the Potrero substation on the peninsula, and we needed to get additional generation to the San Francisco Peninsula to meet all of their load.
Okay, so it sounds like the guardrail is that ISO approval. If in a few years, all of a sudden it was selected as part of the TPP, then they could go to FERC and file for normal TAC cost recovery. But since you haven't given that, then that's the guardrail in terms of this switching to be a TAC line. Yeah.
I would agree with that, yes.
Okay.
All right. Caitlin, I'll go ahead and turn it back to you.
Thank you for that. And thank you everybody for participating today. I'm trying to advance the slide here. Thank you. Like Debbie said, comments are due by end of day March 1st. The comment template is posted on the policy initiative webpage. It's live now, so you can run over there and post your comments. And if you have any questions, feel free to send an email to isostakeholderaffairs@CAISO.com. And again, thank you all for your participation today, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.